Darkling Caster. By Yellow Oats. Make sure to visit the official story page on Royal Road to support the author, link in the description. Synopsis. Gilver, one of the last warlocks, is given the task to take on an apprentice. He has other things he'd rather do, but soul oaths are soul oaths. Cixrus, a doppelganger, wakes up independent. No longer a part of the hive mind that has controlled it for its whole life. Fate will bring these two together, and it may tear them apart again. The realm is changing, species are preparing for war, troubles brewing both underground and on the surface. Hopefully, these two can stay together long enough to weather the storm and survive. Hopefully. Also, can the dwarfs finally decide whether clay cups or metal tankards are better for drinking? End of synopsis. Chapter 1, A Dark Caster. Gilver 9 crone of the 7th night layer flared with light as he spotted his prey. It was a convoy of kelters traveling in the cave beneath him. He ran his tongue slowly across his lips and smiled like a shark. Soon he would devour their energy for his own. He looked down at his ugly withered hand. Magic was not a tool intended for mortals, and as punishment, he paid the price with his flesh. What was once his right hand had twisted into itself, and withered away into a blackened branch like a gnarled old tree. Magic mutated mortal flesh via overuse, and if the flesh couldn't mutate fast enough to keep up with the magic being expended, then it withered. With a mental nudge he opened his mind space, the metaphysical space suddenly expanding into his perception. Incomplete fractals orbited his consciousness like planets orbiting their star. With barely an effort he beckoned some fractal imprints into his mind, the fractal planets suddenly shooting into the star that represented his mind with speed not possible outside the realm of thoughts. His perception of the world cracked and splintered, breaking up and unfolding as his will unified with the fractals, temporarily mentally joining with that which gods forbid mortals from touching. With practiced ease he pulled from his thalamic pool, forcing the magic through the infinitely dividing fractals so it was imprinted with his intentions. With a shiver he forced the fractal out from his mind, shivering as the world shifted out of the kaleidoscope of revelations and snapped back to ordinarily colored mundanity. With another mental push, he wrapped the imprinted magic, folding it up like DNA being coiled into chromosomes. He took the newly formed spell and pushed it easily into the previously well-established channels that led to his withered hand. The crone hissed as his right hand temporarily transmuted into liquid metal and then twisted in on itself, forming into a sword-like structure before hardening, leaving him with a long blade at the end of his arm. The effect of the spell would last until he stopped supplying the limb with the basic amount of magic required to keep the temporary alchemization going, whereupon the limb would shrivel back to its withered form. With another mental nudge and another magic push his sword limb became outlined with eerie green energy. He could almost taste the danger coming off the razor-bladed edge. Gilver 9 crone took a brief run up and then leaped over the edge of the cliff and into the cavern he'd spotted below, his fleshmancy-enhanced legs rippling with previously concealed muscle as he pushed off from the edge. He fell about 30 feet before landing on the floor, his legs taking the impact in stride as he dashed toward the kelters. The kelters raised their long heads warily at the sound of something coming closer. Their instincts screamed at them as they stood paralyzed, still afraid like a rabbit caught in headlights. Soon they could make out a green jagged outline in the dark, like a reaper appearing after the first glimmer of its scythe in the darkness, a thin being dashed forward. Its limbs seemed twisted and impossibly long. Soon they could make out a smiling mouth full of sharp and well-worn teeth as the crone stepped forward to claim his toll. The cave ran gray with tainted kelter blood, butchered pieces of corpses scattered around, portions of their bodies blown and cut away by the speed they had met the blade and fists of the crone. Carts lay on their sides, splintered struts poking out at all angles, and in the center of the area, most of the more intact corpses had been dragged into a pile such that they formed a grotesque hill. Some may call this a massacre, and some may call this art. To the crone, this was the latter. He took pride in his hunts, especially kelters. Kelters were a race of furry humanoids who bred like rabbits and quickly overran other territories. They were seen as a scourge by all other races. At the top of the corpse hill, hunched over, he licked the gray blood from his sword hand. His eyes grew blue as tentacles of energy sprouted from his back and stabbed into the corpses beneath him, absorbing red and gray energy from the bodies. The vital energies pulsed through the tentacles and into his bloodstream, making his major veins and arteries glow a vampiric angry purple. Crone gasped at the intensity of the vibrant cocktail of energy flowing into himself. He had long given up eating food. He could sustain himself far better on the energy of his prey. This one meal would coast him through the next warlock conclave, where he would be tested by the soul stitcher and deemed either worthy of higher knowledge or they would force an apprentice on him. He grimaced at that second possible outcome. Apprentices were frail and stupid, full of stupid morals and kindness. What use was there for these pathetic qualities in this dog-eat-dog world? Crone scowled as he withdrew the magic flow from his right hand and watched as the temporary modification shrank away and vanished, perfect shiny metal turning back into black dead flesh, even more twisted than before. It was the price he paid for using such a corrupted branch of magic. When you cast a spell, you wanted it to be as efficient as possible. After all, the magic leakage often had nowhere to go except mutation and corruption. Some of his spells were the opposite of efficient, powerful, yes, effective, yes, but efficient, absolutely not. He hoped to refine them, but that needed knowledge, time, costly research, and abnormally dangerous experiments. The crone unfolded himself from his hunched position akin to a mantis, and sauntered slowly down the tunnel. He was not eager to reach the conclave. All too soon, and with a butter scowl, he reached the so-called Devil's Maw, a gloomy keep that was headquarters to generations of warlocks, built into the side of the wall of one of the largest caverns in the abyssal barren that was the Sixth Night Lair. This dark fortress was the entrance of the conclave that he so abhorred. Hating even more to waste time, he stalked up the shined and well-worn stones that were the only marker of the path that led to the fortress. It was vital that he stayed on the path with every step, as the protective curse of the fortress smote anyone who strayed from the path. This meant invading soldiers would not be able to launch an effective offensive easily, which was how the warlocks liked it. Reaching a stone face on the side of the fort where the path seemed to go into the rock, he warily put his hand forward, watching as it slipped through the slight resistance of the illusion that hid the entrance. Sometimes Stitcher would play pranks on his fellow warlocks by temporarily solidifying the illusion and watching in glee as the warlocks smacked their faces into the wall. He could get away with pranks like these because he was the strongest, and although the position of the supposed strongest carried some power, it was mostly a lot of responsibility, so the few that reached Stitcher's level never tried to challenge him for his position because there was nothing warlocks hated more than responsibility for others. Stitcher was not like most warlocks. The crone scowled as he saw that the entryway had been painted red with human blood. How very distasteful, he thought. Some warlocks had no class. Although none of them had any morals left, it still felt wrong to massacre the species that had birthed the warlocks. After the entryway was a fork in the path. Both led to the same place, another prank of Stitcher's to confuse intruders. He took the right path, like always. At the end of the path he arrived at the conclave. It didn't need any more protection than that. Warlocks, despite their hate for each other, were quite capable of working together to slaughter any intruders who still managed to get in. The conclave was a colossal stadium-like arena, the bottom of which was filled with a sandy pit. In the center of the pit stood the dark stick-like figure of Soul Stitcher. He inclined his head upon spotting Gilver enter. Gilver let out a grunt of acknowledgement in a reluctant tone. Nothing good ever came from an early acknowledgement from Stitcher. It always meant he wanted something from you. He hoped whatever was wanted wasn't too much of an annoyance. Crone made his way across the seats to the other side of the conclave where the other warlocks had gathered. He grimaced as he recognized the ugly familiar faces of his peers. The reason why the conclave was so big was there used to be a lot more warlocks. There used to be several thousand, however, The holy crusades of the last 12 centuries had slowly whittled that number down to a stifling few, at last count just under 100. It was obvious they would never get back their previous numbers, but it was probably better that way because there would be no new civil wars this way. Also, he did not fancy the competition he would face if there was more of his kind around. Luckily, the Crusades had been a double-edged sword for the Paladins, with both sides losing almost the same number of soldiers in their mutual destruction. The only reason the fighting had stopped was that both sides no longer had the numbers to safely cross the ravine separating their territories. They didn't even have the numbers to defend their territories which had receded, each reduced to a single layer of their previous 12 as much larger factions had claimed the old and used territory. The Night Layers were taken over by the dwarfs and the accursed Kelters, a group of technologically minded weaklings with a knack for making unspeakable war machines, such that other races would prune their numbers to keep them expanding but never would take them on in a direct war. This suited the warlocks very well because it prevented anyone else who might try to steal their ancient secrets from moving in to attack. Last he had heard the Paladins had been assimilated on the other side of the great ravine into the Goliaths faction, the giants having taken a liking to the buffs which the holy monks could provide. Taran Vichan, a pathetic coward, but the closest thing he had to a friend, turned his horse-like face to look at Gilver. "Any luck hunting, brother?" Gilver allowed himself a smirk before speaking in his gravelly. "Indeed, I found a convoy this morning. I painted the walls with them." Taran let out a snort, his equivalent of laughter. "You've better luck than me. I haven't feasted in almost a month. In fact, I was hoping Soul Stitcher had some leftovers. Sadly, no luck there." He pointed to a fresh pile of bones in the corner of the conclave. Gilver glanced around, tallying the members present, and comparing it to his last estimate of their numbers. It seemed only half of what he remembered was here. Before he could ponder upon that, Soul Stitcher spoke up, his echoing voice filling the colossal room unnaturally. "Our numbers are down. A Fenric hunting party took out 40 or so of us, leaving not even resurrectable corpses left." The conclave was filled with angry muttering as the warlocks made their outrage known. It wasn't like they cared much for the missing, they didn't. But it was not a comfortable thought that someone had taken out half of them casually in one go. Especially as it was Fenrics, the very race Soul Stitcher had come from. It was unusual because they had not been seen in this part of the deep before. Gilver's frown deepened as he realized where this might be going. Soul Stitcher's voice rang out again. "I am no longer confident we can keep our ancestral territory safe. So I require each of you present to take a copy of the Mind Seed and get back to your branch strongholds. I do not care if you don't choose to honor your kind by making new conclaves. It is enough that you take an apprentice and attempt to gain immortality." Immortality was the greatest achievement of a magic user. It was akin to stamping on a god's hand and spitting in his face. To achieve it, a magician had to ensure that their mind and soul outgrew the need for a physical body to survive. Many warlocks had partially achieved it in their time. Even he could claim to have almost done it, having slowed his lifespan down to a crawl. However, the act of surpassing it, while possible, was a dangerous feat, as the laws of the world sought to prevent such acts by smiting the individual with lightning in a tribulation. Any warlocks who had achieved the feat had never returned. No one knew if this was because the tribulation or something else had killed them, or they had no interest in returning, but if Soul Stitcher was wagering the survival of their species on it, it meant he truly had no confidence they would survive until next conclave. Which was odd coming from such an optimistic character. Someone at the back spoke up. "But what are you going to do? How will you survive without us to help protect the conclave?" Soul Stitcher smiled for the first time that evening, the hideous crack of his mouth and his thin face slowly stretching up into an unnatural grin. "I will wait until the first of the intruders reaches the inner sanctum, and then I will redirect the fort's protection magic pool into my mind space, and use it to make my fractals go singularity." There was a collective gasp as the warlocks understood the implications. When you tried to imprint a spell imprint with another, they collapsed and imploded, normally taking you with them. But if you shoved enough magical energy, this reaction completely transcended your mind and soul, physically manifesting itself into the world as an ever-consuming phenomenon that threatened to destroy all who entered it. Depending on the magic expended, these phenomena could be anything from a room to a city. And the warlocks had invested generations of thousands of individuals' magical energy into their protections. No one tried to argue with Soul Stitcher, for this was not something he would decide upon lightly. Gilver asked the first question. "Is this all? Have you decided to forego the usual trials conclave entails?" Soul Stitcher gave a shrill laugh. "We will not need them. After all, it will be challenging enough getting out of here alive." This time it was another who spoke up. "You mean we're already surrounded? You daft old fool, why did you invite us here if the ship was already sinking?" Soul Stitcher didn't respond, he just carried on laughing. When he eventually stopped a few minutes later, he spoke into the uncomfortable atmosphere he had created. "Indeed we are. They will not put too much effort into catching you though. It's me they want. And it's me they'll never get." He then gestured and everyone felt a long dormant mental tether. They had almost forgotten they had a pulse. Gilver absorbed the incoming fractal concepts and observed as fragments of many individuals' memories pulsed through the connection before combining and shifting until they formed a seed-shaped mind palace, oddly compact for the collective magical research of an entire species. The mind palace shifted through his thoughts until it reached his mind space, where it took up a place among the spell imprints, connected to his mind via a new mental tether. Soul Stitcher spoke up again. "This is the coveted mind seed. Many of you will not know what it actually is or what it signifies, but it is the culmination of our species' long history of efforts, a mind palace capable of shifting itself to suit an individual, containing the construction parameters of all fractals discovered by warlocks. If cultivated carefully, it is capable of taking root in your consciousness and providing many valuable revelations. It is also capable of quantifying your spells and their effects. I kept them from you because I felt other factions would be less likely to attack us to torture them out of you." Gilver considered the gift. This was perhaps the most valuable thing he had ever been given, and he could see why it was not given out lightly. The mind seed would allow him to form spell imprints and spells from a collection of thousands of researched spell combinations. Gilver stood up, no point waiting around. Who knew how large that fractal singularity would be? Seeing his example, the others followed suit. Upon reaching the exit of the conclave, he turned and gave a nod of respect for Soul Stitcher. It was never a sacrifice he would willingly take, but he should give his thanks all the same, no matter how much he hated the individual. Without another look back, he turned and left the conclave, vowing to never return no matter the circumstances. When he reached the entrance, he came face to face with an advancing army, constantly being smitten with bright energy such that he couldn't even make out the invaders' appearances through the bright flashes. To avoid a direct confrontation, he decided to leave through the back. End of chapter. Chapter 2, A Free Doppel. It awoke in a sweat. It shivered in the thin ragged sheet that was draped over it, with a hole in the top for its head and 2 for its arms. The rag was incapable of keeping in warmth, but it was better than lying on the cold rock naked. It sat up and looked around. It was the first to wake. There were around 50 other doppelgangers with it, all sleeping in a grid to minimize the space taken up by them all sleeping. There was not even room for any of them to get up and walk out in the night, because there didn't need to be. None of them would wake up in the night. Until now. Something was wrong. It tried to connect to the hive mind that normally controlled them, reaching across the mental tether too. There was a high-pitched whine that went through its mind as it suffered a backlash. The connection was broken, and something had disconnected it from the others. It shivered again. It had never been alone with its thoughts like this. Individuals weren't meant to think alone. It felt wrong. How was it to decide what to do and what not to do? With a sinking feeling, it realized it had a name now as well. The hive mind had a name. Individuals of the hive weren't meant to have a name. Cixrus was its name. It knew it intuitively like all beings in this world. With a sinking feeling, Cixrus realized it needed to get out before the hive woke up. It didn't know what happened when the hive came across isolated individuals, but it wouldn't be good. The hive only cared for itself. If you weren't in it, then you were an enemy. If it touched any of the sleeping, then all of them would simultaneously wake up and automatically assume they were under attack, which would probably end in Cixrus being killed. It could not hide and wait for them to leave because the hive mind could see out of 50 pairs of eyes and would be sure to find it. Cixrus surveyed its surroundings. About 5 feet from itself was a protruding spur of rock that poked up from between two of the hive. It would be painful to step on, but would suffice. It also spotted a low-hanging vine within a potentially jumpable distance from the rock. From there it could swing to nowhere. This plan didn't seem so solid. The only place it could reach from the vine was the moving wet. It shivered with memories from that time the hive tried to cross the moving wet. It was a very bad experience. But it would rather take the moving wet over the anger of the hive. It was certain death versus uncertain death. With a sigh, Cixrus quietly flexed its legs. It had better get started. There was no time. With an athletic pirouette of movement, perfected by many of its comrades' broken legs for the hive's idle entertainment, Cixrus leaped with unnerving precision onto the top of the rock, wincing as the sharp point dug into its foot. Knowing it couldn't stop, it transferred the movement into its next step, flying through the air before catching the vine. With a ripping noise and a sudden shuffling of 50 bodies waking up at once, the vine tore from the wall and Cixrus arced through the air. In slow motion it watched itself skim the hair of the individual closest to the water before it skimmed the surface and plopped into the water, gasping as its body suddenly became cold and wet, and the air got pulled away. Cixrus struggled fruitlessly as the currents pulled it this way and that, dragging it under and then back up, making its body spin. Suddenly its hand hit a hard and sharp rock, the pain waking it up from its stupor. With desperation and renewed vigor, Cixrus fought its way to the surface before breaking out of the wet and into the air with a great big breath of relief. After a moment it found that swimming was possible and didn't require as much energy as it thought. Sighing with relief, it rubbed the water from its eyes and spun round. All 50 individuals of the hive were collectively standing on the bank of the river behind it. The expression on the hive's faces was obvious. Malice and rage. 50 pairs of eyes watched the current drag it away at a speed both parties knew was impossible to reach. Cixrus continued paddling and breathed a sigh of relief. But before it could turn back around, it felt itself get pulled under and suddenly speed up as gravity vanished. Cixrus had, unbeknownst to itself, gone over a waterfall. As it rubbed the water from its eyes for a second time, it saw another great wet getting closer and closer at an alarming speed. When Cixrus hit the water this time, it did not stay conscious. For the second time that day, Cixrus awoke. However, this time instead of a confused and afraid isolated Doppel, it was a free and curious one. Also very wet. Water lapped at its sides and it was lying on its front. It had been washed up on a little beach on the bank of the underground river. There was no trace of the massive column of water it had seen just before it lost consciousness. This meant it was probably safe from the hive. Cixrus dragged itself up the bank, choking water out of its system and wincing as the salty sediment of the bank got into the cuts on its foot and hand. After a few moments, it stood up, gingerly shifting its weight onto its unwound foot. Looking around, it was in a very barren cavern. Other than the sandy river bank and a dry mossy patch, there was nothing except the dimly illuminating glowstone or common through most of the caverns. No plants, no animals, no insects. Only cold hard rock. The river seemed to emerge from a river-shaped hole in the wall, and then the cavern sort of tapered down to a tunnel and followed the river. Limping over, Cixrus saw that the tunnel had a little shelf that hugged the wall, allowing it to travel alongside the river without getting more wet. Taking a last look back in the direction it had come from, it took to the tunnel, limping along the shelf as fast as its foot would allow it. The tunnel continued for several miles, which was weird because normally the caverns Cixrus had roamed were dotted through the ground like the holes in cheese. This hinted that maybe it was far lower than it had ever been before. Cixrus shivered from the memories stolen from its hive mind. It remembered stories about the creatures said to lurk in the deeper layers. There were many unspeakable horrors. Apparently, there was an entire civilization of evil warlocks down here somewhere. Warlocks were known for their ability to bend magic into unparalleled destruction. Although such destruction was said to come at a great cost, damage to the caster, they were still feared for their reckless overcasting. Cixrus hoped wherever it ended up that he would get there without encountering any of the horrors described by the lunatic survivors, those few who escaped with their bodies, but not their minds, driven mad by what they saw in the deeper layers. After a few miles of walking, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern. This cavern was perhaps the largest it had ever seen. In the distance something strange was happening. An army of thin white-like figures appeared to be trying to advance towards a stout but menacing dark fortress built into the side of the cavern. However, no matter how much the army pushed forwards, they were being kept at bay by blinding strikes of white energy that illuminated the entire cavern, however, were completely silent, which felt unnatural for how much damage they could do. However, despite the blasts of energy digging up swathes of earth and rock, the blasts seemed to pass straight through the army. Most of the army seemed to be ghosts of some sort, the blasts knocking them around but not actually damaging them. There were a few individuals who were not ghosts, some thin dark figures. Though not many, and they stayed near the back. Cixrus wagered they were controlling the ghosts. The attacking force seemed to decide they had had enough, and one of the dark figures ran forward all of a sudden. Just before the figure reached the white wall of smiting energy, it unleashed a sudden ball of purple energy that expanded around itself in a spherical shield. When the first white energy hit the purple shield, it was caught and seemed to start orbiting the purple shield, picking up speed until it was a spinning white ring. The next bolt of energy to hit the shield was then deflected by the white ring, in the unorthodox method of fighting fire with fire. Cixrus watched the figure advance with fear, trembling at the intensity of the magic being exchanged and thanking its lucky stars that there was an entire cavern between it and the battle. Suddenly it heard a rumbling beside him as a stone wall slowly slid up, revealing a dark low-ceiling passage. Out of the dark hole in the wall stalked a long-limbed spindly figure. It looked like a human, but it was all wrong. The limbs were far longer than they should be, the fingers too. One of its hands was withered and twisted. The warlock looked down at the doppelganger with momentary confusion, and then slowly smiled, its too long smile stretched over its many sharp canines. "Hello, little doppelganger, where's your hive?" Cixrus shivered at the grating quality of the gravelly voice. Its hopes went out the window as it realized it had walked straight into the path of one of the abominations it had hoped it would never encounter. Its flight or fight instincts went into overdrive, but it knew it was incapable of fighting or escaping from what it had encountered. This was a good example of getting out of the frying pan and into the fire. "Do you speak common, ancient or trillenme, little creature? Are you even capable of speech?" Briefly shaken from its state of shock, Cixrus gave a truthful reply. "I have no hive. I am my own individual." Once again the warlock was confused. Its mind had no conception of the situation. Gilver stood confused as he looked down on the short little doppel who stood about 4 feet high. Doppelgangers as a rule were meant to exist as a hive. They had evolved that way. In fact, they were unable to even survive without a hive. They just didn't have the capacity of developing their own minds. Doppelgangers were a race of short creatures, closely related to the homunculi, who were short artificial human-shaped creatures created by the ancients. They had been adapted to naturally form their hive minds and had since grown reliant on that in the last millennium, such that they were incapable of having their own minds. And new hive minds could only be made by splitting existing hives apart, which usually only occurred when resources were unable to support larger populations. Something was wrong with it if it was isolated, either it was lying, or it had been possessed. Gilver warily raised its hands. If the small humanoid was possessed, then it was possibly very dangerous. Beings capable of possession were extraordinarily difficult to defend against. He probably wouldn't even be able to escape if it deemed him a superior vessel. Deciding to take his chances and make a move, he mentally scanned through his spell repertoire. He didn't have many spells that could deal with soul creatures. After a moment he found he had the perfect option. The mind seed linked to his thoughts, feeding him information about the spell imprint he had decided on. Soul Block T2. A projectile spell that temporarily seals the target's soul by sealing soul space with soul attribute magic. Requires an imprint of T1 soulmancy and T1 binding. The target's soul must be undefended and weak. Target must be close to the caster. Leaves the mind unaffected. Target's emotions will also be dulled. Gilver reached inside his mind space and summoned the spell imprints for basic soulmancy and basic binding. He was a tier 2 caster, which meant that he could hold up to 2 spell imprints in the center of his mind at a time. The imprints for soulmancy and binding expanded his mind, stretching it almost to its limits as binding slowed down his thinking slightly, and soulmancy made him suddenly very aware of his small green soul, gently glowing in his soul space, surrounded by the black and red oath chains forced upon all novice warlocks. Dragging his focus back to the task on hand, he reached into his magic pool and dragged an overestimated portion of energy to build the spell. A larger effect was more important. He forced the magic through the infinitely shifting fractals, wrapping them into an ominously glowing packet. With a fluid motion born of practice, he raised his hand and shot the projectile into the Doppelganger, the projectile traveling as an almost imperceptible shimmer. The spell touched the Doppelganger and was fully absorbed into it. This meant the spell had succeeded. The Doppelganger appeared unaffected, which meant it wasn't lying. The spell should have prevented any hive mind communication. This meant that it was likely possessed. "Who are you? I have bound your soul so you cannot possess me. If you lie or tried to cast, I will run you through with my blade immediately." End of chapter. Chapter 3, An Opportunity. My name is Cixrus, that's all I know. I woke up this morning and my connection to the hive had broken, so I escaped. What's your name? Gilver, now sure he was safe from possession, moved closer to Cixrus and pulled his soulmancy imprint into his mind so that he could observe the other creature's soul. From what he could make out, Cixrus had a large soul, far larger than even a human should be, much less a creature that was known to be soul-deprived. What he couldn't see was another soul. If this was a hive or a possession, there would be 2 souls in the Doppel soul space. However, there was only one. This meant either the Doppel was telling the truth or someone had managed to fully transfer their soul to another, completely displacing the recipient's soul and leaving no traces. The latter was thought to be impossible. It was more likely the former. But what could cause a creature's soul to swell much beyond its original size? Gilver gasped because he realized he had read of a similar case. A possessive spirit had been damaged greatly and had sought to possess a body, but instead, the damage had caused it and the victim's soul to completely fuse into a new being. He didn't think it was at all likely, but there would be a simple test to see. "Do you remember a previous life?" There was a blank look on the Doppel's face, and then it started screaming with mental pain, and it blacked out. Well, there was his answer. Gilver decided to not linger any longer, and grabbed the limp Doppel's figure and slung it over his shoulder. Then he cast a stamina-enhancing spell, pushing far more magic than it needed to enhance his abilities. He felt an insane rush that threatened to tear his body at the seams as the latent power in his muscles seemed to multiply. This would really accelerate his mutations, he thought with a frown, but dismissed the thought. He had passed the point of no return long ago. Enhanced Stamina T2. An enhancement spell that temporarily boosts your stamina by flooding your body with vitality attribute magic. Requires an imprint of T1 fleshmancy and T1 circulate. Will accelerate mutation rate. With a leap, he bounded into a sprint, continuously pulsing magic into his muscles to continue the spell. He wound his way around the cavern to the tunnel he had previously come, hoping it wasn't the one the invading force had originated. Leaping over a last protruding rock and slipping into the exit, he took a glance back at the place which had birthed him. The invading force, which he assumed were Fenrics, never having encountered the species before, were covered in a purple shield that seemed capable of reflecting the white bolts that rained down upon it, and had almost reached the entrance. They would probably have to dig their way in, which would give him more time to escape. On the opposite side of the cavern he could see the small black maw of the hidden exit spewing the rest of his kind, who were all casting minor illusion spells for camouflage, or just making a run for it. The Fenrics didn't seem to have any interest in them. Then he turned his back and left. He got several kilometers before there was an unearthly feeling and a great wrongness of something not being right. The magic traces that were naturally in the air seemed to be sucked backward, pulling air with them until a loud whistling filled the cave. Gilver pushed the Doppel's body and his own through a small hollow in the wall as the air sped up, whistling through the cave at an unnatural speed. It was like being near the ravine but 100 times stronger. With burning curiosity, he poked his head out into the onslaught and saw in the long straight passage behind him something black pulsing. It was expanding and contracting rapidly, pulling in more every time it contracted and gripping more every time it expanded. It was like something rapidly taking bites from reality. The size of the singularity's influence is immense, he thought in shock, more vast than any other recorded singularity by hundreds of times. He pulled his head back in and hoped he had made it clear. After several hours, the wind slowed down enough for movements, and Gilver pushed his way through. It had been a long day. He wanted to get back to the ancient home of the Crone warlock bloodline. It was located in a completely other layer, but perhaps if he made good time then he would be able to get there and hide before it became impossible to escape the layer via the influx of investigatory forces. An incident such as this would not go ignored. It would attract the interest of many. Perhaps it would never be safe to return to this layer. After all, no one knew how long it would take such a colossal singularity to die out. Maybe it would last generations. As he turned the corner into a spider-like junction, he heard the trills of the deeply accented common that the Kelters spoke. It was another convey, passing by above him, and they hadn't seen him. Gilver ignored them and continued pushing down a different passage. Killing more Kelters was the least of his current concerns, and their corpses would likely attract more attention than he wanted at the moment. For the third time that day, or what he assumed was the same day, Hathra awoke. He rubbed his head, but the aching didn't seem to come from there. It felt like it came from somewhere far deeper. Hang on, his name wasn't Hathra. No, it was Cixrus. Wait, where did that other name come from? It rubbed its forehead in confusion, but whenever it tried to think more about that, a great pain filled its mind. It did not remember much, only that it had been studied by a warlock before the warlock had asked it a question. He had asked a question? What question? Cixrus realized it couldn't remember anything beyond the warlock opening its mouth. Maybe it had cast a spell on Cixrus. Cixrus was lying on a hard stone floor. It seemed to be in a cave, a very organized cave. There were some books in a corner, and a warped ancient wooden door. On the ceiling hung down luminous light green tendrils of some plant or fungus. There was a pile of clothes by the books, a long gray tunic and some black leggings, and also a pair of boots. Deciding the books, although interesting, weren't a priority, Cixrus slowly stood up and changed into the clothes, impressed at how warm they were compared to the hated sheet it had always worn before. Not making noise, it crept up to the wooden door. The door had no window and the mechanism was a large metal ring with no lock. Slowly it turned the mechanism, which felt very stiff, and suddenly rotated with a clunk. Next Cixrus pushed the door open, wincing as it screeched loud enough to wake the whole cave system. The door opened into a rocky chamber that had been carved out into a roughly hexagonal shape. Each side of the chamber had an inset door leading off in a different direction, and in the center of the chamber was the gaunt warlock, sitting on the floor with its legs folded up, staring at Cixrus. Cixrus froze, as it faced the warlock again. The warlock continued to stare at it, not saying a word. "Hello, thanks for not killing me? I guess," Cixrus finally said. "You interest me." It spoke in that coarse, gravelly voice, raising a thin arm from its dark robes to point at Cixrus in case it wasn't clear that it was speaking to the only other person in the room. Who are you and why?" Cixrus stammered. "I am Gilver 9 Crone. Your soul is formed from a weak doppelganger spirit, fused together with a damaged possessive spirit. Normally this would be impossible, but your soul lacked what it had and its soul lacked what you had, so they stuck together like magnets. So, I'm two people? In a way, I have never encountered this, and I only have come across one recorded example, and that was nowhere near as perfect as your soul. I can't even differentiate between where yours begins and it ends." Cixrus took this in, slightly confused, although it did explain why the connection with the hive had broken. Maybe there was an entirely new set of memories locked away in its head somewhere. Memories of this individual called Hatha, possibly? "I don't remember anything else, though, other than a potential name." "That makes sense. Souls don't repair immediately. Although you are a completely functioning being, it will take time for all the cracks in your now complete soul to fully heal." "So what do you plan to do with me?" Cixrus asked, looking curiously at the warlock. It was certain the creature meant him no harm, though it wouldn't put it past the fearsome warlock to be only interested in him as a test subject. "As it happens, I seem to be in need of an apprentice. The stronghold that held the warlocks has fallen, and as such, the chains which bound my soul to it with forced loyalty have gone slack. In order to free myself of them, I have to take on the last duty asked of me, that of taking an apprentice. You are my only candidate, and you don't seem to have the morals that I so despise in humans." Cixrus was confused, then it slowly came to the realization that the new soul of its must have given it the ability to do what its species normally couldn't: magic. This might be a useful opportunity. Although it didn't trust the warlock, at least it would be made capable of defending itself, now that it no longer had the numbers that its species tended to require in order to survive. "I am open to your offer," it said. Anything was better than dying, and escape was always probably possible. The mutations that plagued warlocks would probably benefit it as well. Extra height and sharp teeth seemed like valuable assets. "Then let us delay no further." The warlock ushered Cixrus through from the main chamber to another one of the side chambers. This chamber was plain and far smaller than the one he had awoken in. In the middle of the chamber was a white stone pedestal, with a gently rippling transparent orb on top. The orb was full of a murky, shifting substance, and suspended in that substance were segments of black and red chains that snaked around a black center that couldn't be made out. The warlock motioned towards the orb. "This is the heart of the Crone bloodline of warlocks, of which I am the last, an oath that you will never leak our secrets to outsiders unless they are themselves apprenticed, an oath to yourself. It will not force loyalty from you, but it will prevent you from telling outsiders of the location of any warlock strongholds or safe houses. Although there are probably less than 50 of us, we must continue our legacy." Cixrus pondered the oath. It was not bad. It would still be able to escape and never return. Even if it escaped, there would be no danger of warlocks coming after it if they knew it couldn't share their secrets. "What do I do?" "Plunge your hand into the orb and do not resist what happens to you." Cixrus nodded and braced itself in case it hurt, pushing its hand into the orb. At first, nothing happened. It felt just like it had pushed its hand into the water. Then a cold feeling ran into it, pushing through its mind and body and entering a place deep inside of itself which it assumed was its soul. Then it could faintly feel a chain wrapping around that place. The singular black and red chain looped itself in a circle before it could join together, though it suddenly connected to its mind. The terms of the oath that the warlock had spoken were communicated to it in a thought form that was intuitive to understand. There was a mental query of agreement attached to the end of the thought which he agreed to. Suddenly the chain snapped into place, and it felt his soul suddenly become denser, as the oath aided the healing of his soul and somehow reinforced the structure of it too. It turned out this oath had benefits to it. Cixrus felt the new part of its soul suddenly match up with the old in a way that it hadn't quite before, and it slipped into a dreamlike state as memory after memory burst into its mind, filling its head with knowledge and events from a past life. Chapter 4: The Archivist. Hathor sat at his desk bored. He was in a dinky but cozy room, with bookcases and scroll holders covering all four walls. The room had two small doors. One was the entryway where the wizards would enter to request access to books or the library, and the second was by far his favorite, the actual library itself, with shelf after shelf ceiling high and stacked to the gunnels. For a book lover like him, it was heaven, although some windows would be nice if only he wasn't so far underground. Alas, this library was full of academy secrets, and he had been carefully selected by a council of paranoid wizards as the ideal person to be its archivist. What danger was a library full of forbidden texts and research that they didn't even trust each other to look at for long periods of time in the hands of someone like him who couldn't even perform magic? Of course, he had scoured the shelves for a remedy for that, a mystical book that could give the mundane magic. But sadly these things were not something that could be encountered. His soul was missing a vital piece, and although the rest of his soul was filled with enough talent to reach at least tier 3, he was missing the little bit that let him even connect to a thalmic pool, sadly a common human affliction. He flipped his sand timer, a gift from his wife before she had left him oh so long ago. It was a gilded piece of art on a little oiled bearing that was fitted with magnets so it could be satisfyingly flipped perfectly into place. Not wanting to break the trinket with repetitive flipping, he decided to stand. Another peruse of his shelves wouldn't hurt after all. Hathor rose and flipped the sign on the back of the wizard's entry door saying he would be back in half an hour, making sure he locked it. The door was fitted with a bell that would tinkle when opened, but that could never be trusted around those who could silence entire rooms. At least the enchanted lock would prevent anyone up to a tier 4 from entering. Hathor then slipped into his library with a sigh of relief, taking a deep breath of the smell of ancient books that he loved so much, allowing one of his fingers to trail along a nearby row of book spines. The first section catered to geography and history. The shelves stretched away into the darkness, the ground dusty except for the singular sets of footprints that belonged to him that curved from the main path and bounced around the bookshelves, as most wizards simply weren't interested. The second section was politics and psychology, which had more footprints, but fewer books. Although they pretended they hated it, human wizards quite liked the art of politics. Maybe it was because it gave them a different sense of power, he wouldn't know. However, he never trusted the wizards who frequented this section. He knew how manipulative they came to be. Philosophy and religion were after that, another largely unused section. The art of wizardry itself was against heaven, so most wizards never bothered to learn what rules set by the supposed unseen divines that they were breaking. Only the ones who did politics occasionally came here, and Hathor himself, because he wanted his education to be well-rounded. He sometimes thought that those 3 sections had only been put there because it was known how little interest wizards had in them, and if they had to walk through them all the time it might spark a passing interest that led them to investigate. Finally made his way through to the most well-used part of the library. Here the most interesting subjects, as defined by wizards, could be found. This made up 90% of the library, shelf after shelf of general spells, imprints, sciences, theories, combat techniques, battle magic, cultivation, miracles, enchantment, magic raft, rituals, and healing. A true treasure trove of magical knowledge. Oh, how he loved these books, but alas, love for them would never get him any close to performing what they described within their pages. He glanced over at the general spells row, immediately noticing a large tattered book with a worn-down spine that poked out from the shelf more than the rest. This wouldn't do, these books were meant to be brought to him to repair. He slid the heavy book out and flicked through its contents. General Spells and Cantrips of the High Wizard Magus Garamond Stromberrow was the title on its first page. He briefly entertained himself with the thoughts of how much it must have annoyed the other wizards in formal events when pronouncing their full names was mandatory. The book was filled with page after page of spell combinations, references to where one could find the imprints for them, and cantrip techniques. Cantrip techniques were where one employed an advanced line of mathematics to attempt to combine two spell imprints into one. It was not like imprinting an imprint, a fool's game. It was a very esoteric line of casting that was quite inefficient, but allowed one to cast complex spells far quicker than they could by cobbling together the larger spells from as much as 7 or 8 different imprints. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed the spine appeared to crack more. He sighed, more work to do. Just as he was about to close the book, the spine finally broke, and sigils traced along it, as a long dormant enchantment flickered to life. He stood there for a moment shocked, wondering what its purpose was as sigils traced through the air and formed themselves into an arrow that pointed off into the library. It must be a proximity locator enchantment, or variant. Interesting, he hadn't seen one of those in a while, and it appeared to be a different design from the one he had seen before. Hathra followed the arrow, wondering if it pointed to a sister tome or something completely different. The spell pointed him out of his library, into his archive room, and out the exit. He wasn't meant to wander the deeper halls of the academy at these hours, however, curiosity had him in a tight grasp. The spell led him to the main access point for his floor. Each of the academy's floors was carefully designed with a single point of exit and re-entry, such that in the case of infiltration or invasion, all the floors could be sealed off until the potential invader was repelled. The entry points were like Magitech airlocks, with 2 big blast doors made of solid titanium and covered in pressure distribution enchantments. The pointer led him through the metal doors and then to the large helical spiral staircase, down another 3 floors to an armory station. Armory stations were key defensive points that were manned at all times. They were filled with emergency supplies and automatic weapons. All armory stations had translatorate portals, a special aperture that would relocate you into wells spread throughout the city that was home to this academy. This armory station was closed, and it obviously had been for some time. There were several automatic defensive spell pylons poking out the wall, but they were all cracked and old, definitely not still in use. The spell pointed him to the door, and then the pointer floated over to the indentation which was meant for a key. The pointer shifted itself into a long serrated key that looked like you could stab someone with it, and slid into the lock, turning itself, and then pulling out as the heavy magically reinforced dark stone door swung open with a low rumble and a spray of dust. The archivist looked down at himself, and his now grimy robes, and shrugged. He had been meaning to wash them anyway. Cautiously he stepped forward, hoping the door wasn't trapped. He had no way to detect or defend himself from any traps. The door was not trapped, and it opened into a long passage. Hathra, a slave to his curiosity, walked along the passageway, wondering why they hadn't renovated this armory station. There was a loud rumble as the door slid shut behind him. Hopefully, he'd find a way to reopen that. Soon the passageway opened into a dingy room. It was about the same size as his archivist's chamber, but was very different and positively ancient. There was a shelf containing some books, an oddly active-looking translatorate portal, and where there were normally food supplies and weapons was a large, bulky hulk of prototyped Magitech, which still glowed and was wired into the portal with an unusually large amount of enchanted runic traces and metal conduits. The pointer, still in key form, hovered over to the Magitech machine and then hovered through a metal panel, the construct being absorbed into the machine. Hathra watched in fascination as it came to life, rings of light and runes brightening all over the machine. Then a low whine started, and with a pulse, the machine emptied whatever energy it had been charging along its conduits. The machine went dead dark as it transferred its energy to the portal. The portal seemed to splutter and screech as the energy sparked across it in a web. Then suddenly all the arcing energy was pulled into the center, and the machine seemed to stabilize as the energy seemed to create a purple film that filled its aperture. Unlike other portals where the film would sort of pull away into a cone behind it, indicating it led somewhere, this portal seemed to stay flat. Hathra reached forward in fascination. He knew portals weren't that dangerous, and you could always pull yourself back out before you got transported. His hand seemed to touch the film, and then pass through, then suddenly a great force grabbed it, and in one fluid motion, pulled the rest of his body through. Hathra found himself floating in purple energy, suspended in the portal and suddenly devoid of emotions. Then the machine flickered to life again, and started sending pulses down its conduits once more. The purple energy surrounding him brightened and brightened, then his body went limp and fell out of the energy. However, Hathra wasn't part of his body anymore. The machine had pulled his soul out. Hathra realized quickly that he was no longer solid, and that he no longer had any limbs. The orb that was his soul could vaguely feel something happening as the purple energy increased in concentration, slowly getting stronger and brighter until he could not sense anything else. Then it seemed to reach a limit, and the energy flooded into his soul. It flooded all to one part of his soul, a pool of energy that he had never been able to sense before. This must be the thaumic pool, he realized. The energy rushed into this pool, solidifying its connection to the rest of the soul and then increasing its capacity. The capacity grew faster and faster, and soon he found his soul felt like it was tearing apart. Perhaps if he had been an actual wizard and had learned how to control this energy, then he might have been able to prevent this. But he was not, and so his inflated pool of magic soon overflowed, tearing through walls and damaging his soul. He wasn't even able to scream over the intense pain of being torn apart that filled his every thought and soon stopped him from thinking. Something about the damage to the soul sent the forced cultivation prototype haywire. This was the second time it had been activated, and it had never been intended for use on a damaged mortal soul. It was meant to be used on a high wizard's soul, just as they were trying to achieve immortality. Something in the machine broke down, and the energy being confined in the portal suddenly found itself free. Hathra didn't remember anything more except for the vague feeling of being flung around, through the ground, down and down, until eventually, the last remnant of him found itself in a small doppelganger's body, with a soul fragment that seemed to fit together with his like two pieces of puzzle. End of chapter. Chapter 5, Full Awakening. Cixrus gasped as the foreign memories and knowledge finally came to a stop. It's a very weird feeling suddenly gaining two sets of memories. One set the collected general knowledge from a studious archivist, and one the primitive antics of a relatively dim centuries-old hive mind. He could sense that now he was Cixrus, and although both sets of memories belonged to him, he was either. Hathra's inherited knowledge informed him that every soul has a name, no two have the same, and each name identifies a soul. Cixrus realized it probably wasn't the best idea giving his name out to strangers, because they might be able to use it to target spells. It was something he would have to be careful of in the future. Gilver looked at Cixrus with slight concern. It was clear something had happened to the Doppel, for it was not normal for someone to fall into a trance when taking an oath. It was meant to be a quick process, not a half-hour-long one. Maybe the oath chains binding its soul had accelerated the process of soul healing, and now it was reliving memories. Either way, Gilver was not a patient creature. Growing bored of the glassy-eyed small creature, he conjured a ball of green energy and tossed it between his hands. As he did so, he felt something shift inside him, somewhere around his soul. With haste, he pulled the basic soulmancy imprint into his mind and turned his gaze inwards. He had two oath chains wrapped around his soul. The first was to the crone bloodline, originating from the same orb that his new apprentice had his hand submerged in, and the second was to the conclave. He realized now that he had gained an apprentice, and the conclave no longer existed. The oath served no purpose and was now in the process of coming undone. Slowly he watched the chains fall away, and dissipate into some dark energy, which was quickly absorbed by his small green soul. As the chains vanished, he found a mental restriction lifting too. He was no longer just limited to spells of the dark and neutral spells, he would now be able to learn spells of the light as well. This was actually a pretty great boon, as most of the healing spells with the less mutagenic side effects belonged to the light spells. The only spell he currently had in his repertoire that could heal was his Tier 3 spell, Leeching Tentacles, which allowed him to steal magic, soul energy, and vitality from fresh corpses. This spell was very ideal, and it even allowed him to collect soul energy, something that was very difficult to harvest normally. Soul energy was used to heal the soul and create spell imprints. However, the way the spell collected the energy without filtering it meant he absorbed many impurities that greatly increased the speed of his mutations. Perhaps now he would be able to add a purifying aspect to the spell? He rubbed his chin in thought. There were several hurdles to this idea, the first being that he had simply no idea where to find a purification spell imprint, as it was something previously abhorred by the warlocks, and due to all his imprints coming from them, he had never had to find one on his own before. The second was that creating new spell combinations was quite the research-intensive challenge, and he wasn't sure how corruption and purification magic would react to being in the same spell. Would they cancel out? Would they make compiling the spell impossible? Would it work completely fine? He had no idea. These were new topics of interest for him. There was a stumble across the room all of a sudden, and he looked across to see Cixrus stumbling backwards, away from the orb of oaths. Cixrus grabbed the pillar the orb was on, and shook its head slightly. "Did some of your memories return to you?" Cixrus turned in confusion and spotted Gilver. "Yes, I seem to be an archivist in a human academy who accidentally activated a weird prototype machine, created long ago. It damaged his soul, and the damaged soul just happened to come across my body." Gilver raised a long thin eyebrow in response. There were many relics of the ancients, and most were pretty dangerous. After all, the things normally built to last were the most dangerous. How much of the archivist's soul survived? Only the memories. Almost none of the personality was left. He wasn't capable of using magic, but he had a decently sized magic pool, which I assume is now a part of mine. The one thing that has survived through oddly is his perception of his gender. I have the sense that I am male now, despite my species only having no concept of gender. Interesting. I will take a look at your soul. Gilver reached into his mind space and pulled the basic soulmancy imprint into the forefront of his mind and directed the focus of the rune out of his body to Cixrus' soul. He stared at the red orb that was its soul. The red-colored soul was surrounded by a black chain that was exerting some sort of pressure on the soul, forcing it to slowly become more dense and solid. Pushing deeper, he could make out the separation of the mind and soul. Cixrus had one mind, but next to the mind were two soul pieces that were slowly meshing together. Along the periphery of the soul, he could distinctly see two separate magic pools, each showing no sign of merging together. It seems you have two separate magic pools, which will likely not merge together. This is not something I have encountered before, but I doubt it will impact your casting. You might have some difficulty at the start though. Most magicians don't have to learn how to pull magic from two separate pools. Maybe it will be a boon in the future? Cixrus pondered the matter. Hopefully it would not interfere with learning magic. In fact, he was desperate to start learning now. Inheriting the memories and lifetime wishes of another person seemed to have considerably boosted his motivation. Can we start lessons now? Gilver? Call me master, for that is what I am to you. And yes, we shall start now. Gilver thought for a moment where to start. The mind seed would be a good place. He wished he had had it from the beginning. Maybe its benefits would have been amplified by now if he had. I will connect a mental tether to your mind. This will be very useful in the future. And I also need to use it to gift you something. Do not resist. Gilver placed his hand on Cixrus' forehead, and then called the basic mindmancy imprint to the forefront of his mind. His thoughts seemed to suddenly expand, the rune giving him a window into his mind and the construction of each thought. The magical phenomenon which led to consciousness was an infinitely complex process. Gilver channeled magic into the rune, carving his intentions into the mana and shaping it into a long, thin strand. Mental tethers were a weak but useful magic construct. They allowed for short-distance telepathy and for transmission of memories. Tether T1 creates a tether connecting your mind with others. This tether can be used for short-range telepathy and transmission of memories. Requires an imprint of T1 mindmancy. Requires direct contact with the recipient. Requires the recipient to have an open and accepting mind. The imprint opened his eyes to Cixrus' mind. It was large and foreign, as all other minds were. Mindmancy was a difficult branch of magic that required you to know a lot of prerequisite knowledge before even attempting, and even then it required years of study to go any further beyond the simplest mental enhancements and constructs. As well as the fact that affecting others' minds was exponentially more difficult. Unless, of course, you wanted them to stop thinking entirely. That just required a lot of magic and you to wield your mind spells like a hammer recklessly. Locating the areas of his apprentice's mind that dealt with thought and communication took a while, but Gilver eventually spotted some familiar mechanizations. Before the other mind could shift again, after all, minds constantly evolved, Gilver reached out and connected the other end of the spell to a specific pattern, anchoring it into place. There was a shift as the tether was accepted by Cixrus, and then the tether was suddenly jolted into motion, moving around and being pulled in close as the mind accepted the connection and pulled it closer to its thoughts. There was a pulse of magic and then the connection stabilized, forming a pale luminous thread in Gilver's sight that stretched between them. Gilver then pulled the mind seed to the forefront of his mind, accessing its myriad of functions to convey his intentions to the mind construct. Warlock Mind Seed, 2%. Dive. Meditate to receive revelations about imprints. Growth. Meditate to enhance the mind seed's growth. Germinate. Create an immature mind seed. Possession. Use the mind seed as a vessel to steal another's body. Sprout. Requires mind seed to be fully grown. The imprint opened his eyes to Cixrus' mind. It was large and foreign, as all other minds were. Mindmancy was a difficult branch of magic that required you to know a lot of prerequisite knowledge before even attempting, and even then it required years of study to go any further beyond the simplest mental enhancements and constructs. As well as the fact that affecting others' minds was exponentially more difficult. Unless, of course, you wanted them to stop thinking entirely. That just required a lot of magic and you to wield your mind spells like a hammer recklessly. Locating the areas of his apprentice's mind that dealt with thought and communication took a while, but Gilver eventually spotted some familiar mechanizations. Before the other mind could shift again, after all, minds constantly evolved, Gilver reached out and connected the other end of the spell to a specific pattern, anchoring it into place. There was a shift as the tether was accepted by Cixrus, and then the tether was suddenly jolted into motion, moving around and being pulled in close as the mind accepted the connection and pulled it closer to its thoughts. There was a pulse of magic and then the connection stabilized, forming a pale luminous thread in Gilver's sight that stretched between them. Gilver then pulled the mind seed to the forefront of his mind, accessing its myriad of functions to convey his intentions to the mind construct. Warlock Mind Seed, 2%. Dive. Meditate to receive revelations about imprints. Growth. Meditate to enhance the mind seed's growth. Germinate. Create an immature mind seed. Possession. Use the mind seed as a vessel to steal another's body. Sprout. Requires mind seed to be fully grown. Mentally he selected the germinate option and watched as the mind seed glowed brightly, then with a pulse a small point separated off from the mind seed and swelled into an equal size. The original mind seed didn't remain unaffected if visibly dimmed and shrank slightly as the 2% progress ticked back down to 0%. Gilver noted the change. Luckily, he would probably never need to perform this ever again. He pulled the basic mindmancy imprint into the front of his mind and used the extra innate power given by embracing the imprint to enhance his mental grip. Then he grasped the new mind seed and pushed it through the new mental tether to Cixrus. Cixrus felt the seed enter his mind. It crawled across his mind like a spider with many legs, attaching mental tethers this way and that. He could feel it invading his thoughts, and then it found the memory of him making its oath. A long tether branched into his soul to make sure the memory was valid and he really had the oath. It seemed very cautious and unsure, then it suddenly withdrew, pulling all its tethers back except one. The mind seed folded into itself, growing smaller, and then pushed itself through the center of his mind and into a space that hadn't existed before. He felt his thoughts waver as this new space seemed to stabilize. When it had become solid, he could suddenly feel an expanded area in his mind where the incomprehensible shifting construct that was the mind seed orbited his mind slowly. End of chapter. If you enjoy the story, please leave a like and comment to let me know you want more. Make sure to support the author by liking the official story page on Royal Road, link in the description.